everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined once again by Graeme Macrae Burnet. It's been a wee while, Graeme, since you were on. What was it, Gorski?
Yeah, it was the last part of the Gorski trilogy, Case of Matricide, which was only about a year ago.
Oh,
so,
is it?
Yeah, but always good to talk to you.
And we're here to talk about Benbecula, which is your entry into the Darkland Tales series, published with Polygon Books and out on the 2nd of October. So I think as you hear this podcast, it will be out and available. First of all, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm doing very well, yes.
Good.
Yep.
And before we talk about Benbecula in detail, how did you come to write a Darkland Tale yourself?
Well, I was approached at the Edinburgh Book Festival opening party by Jamie Crawford, who's the commissioning editor of the series. And also now the chair of the Edinburgh Book Festival. He's a busy man. Also runs Take 4 Books on Radio 4. Don't know how he keeps all those plates spinning. And he asked if I'd be interested in writing one. I was aware of the series. I think the series has really established itself really quickly in the sort of Scottish literary scene. And I think it's been a great concept. I think the sort of short form, great authors writing for it. So as soon as he asked me, I was like really keen, to do it. And then he asked me if I had an idea, and I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. Because there was this case that I came across during the research for his bloody project, the case of Angus McPhee, who murdered 3 members of his own family. Obviously, we're going to talk further about that. Yeah. So I sort of floated that idea to him, and he said, that sounds interesting. And we agreed to meet up in a more sober environment in a few weeks. And I think I then went away and looked to see what documentary evidence was in the National Archive, and I felt like there was enough there to build what I ended up writing. And so I outlined that to Jamie and got the green light.
So we should say perhaps that it's a certain format, it's novella.
Yes.
And it has to be about something incident in Scottish history.
That's right, yeah. So it's got to be based on a true event or a known figure. I think my one is slightly interesting in that the case of Angus McPhee is almost entirely unknown.
Yeah.
Very, very few people have heard of it. It's never, to my knowledge, been written about at any length. And even at the time, it didn't make a great deal of impact, which is extremely surprising to me. Once I'd started doing the research, I did say to Jamie, if I was writing something on my own about this, because it wasn't a known case, my instinct would have been to write a non-fiction piece about it. And he said, well, that's all very well, but that's not what I'm commissioning you to do. Yeah. And that's as it should be, Yeah. So I then had to think through how I would approach it from a sort of novelistic point of view.
And it brings up, when I started reading it and it said it's a true story, I'm thinking, well, why should we believe Graeme? Because we've been in this area before.
That came up. I did the very first event. I was at the Wigtown Book Festival just the weekend past, and the first event about Benbecula, the new book, and somebody in the audience puts their hands up and says, yes, well, of course you're saying it's true, but you said that about his bloody project and it was all fiction, so I'm not going to believe this. So I'm already running up against that scepticism, which is entirely my own doing and own fault, but it kind of amuses me as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It amused me, and I have to admit, when I started reading it, did a bit of digging myself to check this is, unless Graeme has gone to incredible lengths to create this story. Yeah. And there's a sizable afterword here as well.
Yes, well that was a kind of, I think there are other books in the series that have some sort of afterword. I know Val McDermott's one does. Yeah. But yeah, I did say that to Jamie. Well, I'm totally happy to write this sort of novella, the fictionalised version, but because the archival research that I did, to me, was so interested and does provide the factual underpinnings of the story, I felt it was important and would be interesting to outline what I'd actually come across in the archive.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. So why this story, though? You said you already had one there when Jamie asked you. Why did you have it there and ready to go? What had already piqued your interest?
Like almost everything I've written up to this point, has been an idea that's been in my head for maybe 10 years or so, you know, or more in some cases. And, you know, as I've probably said, we may have done a podcast about his bloody project 10 years ago, and I would have explained how that was inspired by a French case of Pierre Rivière, peasant who murdered 3 members of his own family. So that was kind of the inspiration for his bloody project, in which my crofter, Roddy Macrae, murders 3 of his neighbours. And as I say, it was during the research for his bloody project that I came across the case of Angus McPhee, who murders 3 members of his own family. So there was a parallel with the Pierre Rivière case, and also with my fictional Roddy Macrae case. It just seemed freakish.
Yeah.
So I mean, it couldn't not have stuck in my mind. But the other thing, that when I was researching his bloody project, the thing that I was really fascinated by were cases, 19th century Scottish cases, in which there was a plea of insanity. Because that's how Roddy Macrae, he pleads insanity in his bloody project. So I was looking for real cases in which this had happened, and the case of Angus McPhee was one of those. And in fact, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but, you know, the plea of insanity as an acceptable mitigation to guilt came to pass in 1843, both in England and in English law and Scots law, the Macnaghten Rule. And so the case of Angus McPhee was in 1857, so it was only 12 years. So it may well have been one of the very first cases where this plea was put forward in a Scottish case. And, you know, the case went to court. I'm not giving anything away here. He was found guilty, but with the mitigation of insanity, which meant that he wasn't hanged. He was imprisoned in the General Lunacy Department of Perth Prison, under the care of James Bruce Thompson, who happened to be a character in his bloody project. So this was another sort of just freakish piece of sort of synchronicity that appealed to me.
Has anyone else made that link yet? Is that?
Well, not as far as I know, but, you know, the book's not quite out in the world. You know, we're in the very sort of we're in the birthing pool at the moment, waiting for it to.
I do remember, I think, when we spoke about, when you first told me that you were going to do a Darkland Tale, that there was a link. His bloody project. Were you already writing that when you kind of heard about?
Oh yeah, I was well at 2/3 of the way into writing his bloody project, because I did the research for his bloody project in stages, and I wrote the Roddy Macrae's memoir, which is like a half or 2/3 of the book, and that only once I'd written that did I go away and do the legal research, which was when I came across the case of Angus McPhee. I should give some credit here to an author called Malcolm Archibald, who's written a book called Whiskey Wars and Murder or something like that, which is a kind of compendium of crime in the 19th century, and that's where I came across the reference to Angus McPhee, and there's 2 or 3 pages about the case in that book. So that was how it first came to my attention. So credit where credit's due, and that is of course mentioned in the acknowledgements of the book.
I was thinking about the format for you as well, the novella. Do you feel it suits your writing? Because you're not one who likes to waste words, I would say.
I don't like to waste words, and most of my other 3 novels are all sort of between 75 and 90,000 words, so moderately short, but I feel that's a good length for a novel. I think what
were there challenges then with writing the shorter bit?
I would say not a challenge, but an opportunity, and the opportunity for me in writing what was supposed to be 30 to 35,000 words, which is almost exactly what it is. Well, I felt it gave me the opportunity to be a little bit more experimental and to divest myself of certain conventions, which if you were reading a 500-word novel and something's trying your patience, you might give up. But if it's only 130 pages, you're probably going to persevere. Not that I think the novel requires perseverance, but I felt liberated And so, at first, in the earlier drafts, I was much more experimental with punctuation,
Right.
And I
Okay.
divested myself of a lot of punctuation, and that's the sort of thing that often I find irritating in other authors' work.
Yes.
I like just put the quotation marks in, But the reason I did it was because when I was reading the precognition statements, which were the main body of the evidence in the National Archive, they were almost entirely unpunctuated, and they didn't use any apostrophes whatsoever, even for the genitive. So I thought, I wanted to kind of mimic that style.
Yeah.
And I kind of realised, maybe when I was well into the first draft, that it was kind of amusing to me, but nobody's going to know that that's why I'm doing this.
Of course.
So it was, in that sense, it seemed a little bit self-indulgent. But so I shifted a little bit on that, and then. But unlike my other books, I don't use quotation marks for direct speech. But there is a reason for that in the book, which is to do with wanting the different voices in the book to kind of meld together and not be separated from each other. So I retained that, and I just use less commas than I normally do.
Yeah.
And that was quite liberating as well.
And the McPhees as a family, can you talk a bit about them as they appear in the book?
Yeah, so there's Angus McPhee was 25 years old. He's described as a labourer. They live in a small crofting house in south of Benbecula in an area called Linneclet. So there's Angus, his older brother Malcolm, very crucially, his older sister Marion, and a younger brother called John. So there's 4 children, and they lived with their parents, who were quite aged.
Yeah.
They were in their 70s when they were murdered. So they must have been quite old when they gave birth to these children, who were all between 20 and 30 roughly at the time of the murders. I sense they were probably they were not a well-to-do family. They were
Sure.
still involved in the kelp industry,
Yeah.
which was pretty tough work and not very economically rewarding. Beyond that, when I was reading, maybe I should explain that in the National Archive, the bulk of the material that I based the story upon was what are called the precognition statements, and these are witness statements from the various surviving members of the family, and also by neighbours about what they saw both on the day of the murders and in the aftermath of the murders. They're very focused on the actual events of the day, but you can read a little bit between the lines, and you begin to get a sense sometimes that there was some sort of oddities about this family. They were perhaps quite eccentric. At one point somebody mentions, other members of the family being subject to sort of fits of madness, but it's passed over. And then there are some young female witnesses, and they sort of refer to feeling that they're being followed by Angus McPhee, and they're clearly scared of him, and he seems to be something of a menace to the young women of the parish, and you think, okay, he's a bit of a sex pest, this guy. So you just get these little hints, and you kind of feel like a bit of a detective in reading between the lines in these documents, because also these are not the direct words of the witnesses, because they're being written down by somebody who was called a writer, a legal writer, taking the statement, and also they would have been speaking Gaelic, and all these statements are written down in English, so there's a process of translation as well. Sure. So there's a little bit of distance. I think they were. I couldn't say they were outcasts, but there's a sense that they were maybe slightly a family of outcasts.
Because there seems to be excuses made at the beginning, at least, for Angus. He's a bit wild, he's a bit like this, or he doesn't hold a job for any length of time, he's kind of, in conflict with any employers and things like that.
Yeah, the story begins So, I mean, the decision I made, and this kind of goes back to the commission to write a fictionalised account. So, having agreed to write a fictionalised account, of course, as the novelist, you have to decide who's going to tell the story, and how are you going to narrate the story. And I very quickly, and in a very instinctive way, just decided that the story was going to be told by Malcolm, who's Angus's older brother.
Yeah.
So there's kind of two aspects to the story, which is Malcolm recounting the events leading up to the murders in the sort of past tense, and then there's a present tense of Malcolm's current, existence in Benbecula, which is entirely fictional.
Yeah.
He's living alone. He's completely isolated in the cottage, and this is much more in a sort of almost internal monologue, which maybe speaks more to the sort of experimental side that I mentioned before. But all the episodes that Malcolm relates regarding Angus's murders are all in the documents. They're all based on what I read. I mean, of course, I embellish and fictionalise them, but all these events actually occurred. And the very first event that's really mentioned was that 10 weeks or so before the murders, Angus had been away working on a shoemaker's house in North US, and he came back and he'd just gone mad. He was wild and pulling at his hair and violent, and they had to tie him down to his bunk and restrain him. And again, these were things that I'd come across in when I was researching his bloody project. That the people weren't sent to the local asylum or hospital. There was no, in these outlying places, there was no real medical facilities, but people were. It's almost what we call care in the community now.
Sure.
And it was accepted that some people had fits of madness, and sometimes they would just be restrained by their families, or the community would take a role in doing that, or so on. And in this instance, the community came round, expressed concern, and it was talked about that Angus should be sent to an asylum. But it cost money, and nobody had any money.
Yeah.
And that's it. So yeah, I mean, clearly there was something up with Angus, and whether this insanity came upon him because of a particular cause, an event that happened during this period of employment, a blow to the head, or some sort of traumatic experience. I mean, that's just would be a matter of speculation. I don't really speculate about it in the book.
No.
But it may also be that this was only one in a series of such similar episodes. Although that's not really said. So I think something did happen to him.
Because Malcolm kind of speculates as well.
Yeah.
He kind of thinks, what could have happened here without getting any answers.
No, and at one point he does go and he goes back to the house. I mean, that's a fictional episode where I send Malcolm to the house, because it feels like that's what he would have done. He would have gone and said, look, my brother came back, he's completely mad. What happened? Yeah. And he gets short shrift, and then goes a bit mad himself.
And one of the questions I had while reading is, what? Because his other siblings leave, but he stays, and I don't know whether that's fictional or factual, but why in your head did he stay?
In my head, Malcolm is a person who he doesn't see future possibilities. He's somebody who's accepting of his lot in life, and he thinks that any sort of ambition or attempts to improve yourself are only likely to end in disappointment, or it's almost as if you shouldn't get above your station and stuff like that. Whereas, the two siblings, they at one point, they go to Malcolm, they're like, Malcolm, there's nothing here for us. Yeah. Malcolm knows that, but he accepts it. But they don't accept it, and they're like, well, maybe we can have a better life. And this is a period where obviously people were either being forced to leave these communities, or were leaving voluntarily because there were very few economic opportunities. And in fact, Benbecula and the US, if you look at the statistical accounts of Scotland, which of course are tremendous source of information for any project like this. He's written by the local parish Church of Scotland minister, so there isn't actually one about Benbecula, because Benbecula was a Catholic enclave.
Right.
So it's mentioned in the ones about North and South Uist. But because of the kelp industry earlier in the 19th century, the kelp industry had brought a huge number of people to those islands. So the ministers there refer to the islands as being overpopulated, and this was a problem that had to be dealt with, which of course is feels quite dodgy given the history of clearances and so on. But people were leaving, and the population was shrinking at that time. So people would certainly have sought work elsewhere and so on.
Because Malcolm kind of says the way of life is dying.
Yeah, it says that on the first page.
And perhaps, like you said, it's already dead.
Well, yes. I mean, especially they've clung to the sort of kelp industry, and he's clung to it because it's just what they know.
Yeah.
And he feels. I mean, Malcolm's like probably 35 years old.
Yeah.
But he feels like. When I was writing him, he felt like a much older man,
Yes.
And he feels he's not about to embark on a sort of career change.
No.
And people didn't. I don't think the mentality was of having a career. This is what we do.
And I think that's something that continued until not that long ago as well. I had relatives who that was what they did, and then they retired, and the thought was never to go do anything else. Yeah,
and also, although they did, both Malcolm and the brother Angus went off to do some labouring for other people, and they would have had what we might call a portfolio career now, where they did, had different income streams, or maybe their barter arrangements or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, Angus is not described as a crofter. He's described in the documents as a labourer. So he's maybe just somebody who went and worked for other people.
I also wondered, it seemed to me that Malcolm almost takes on the guilt of the family.
Yeah.
That he might see it as cowardly to leave. He stays and kind of takes on the slings and arrows of everyone else who knows what's happened.
He sees the what Angus has done as a kind of stain on the family.
Yeah.
Something that he is stained by. I suppose in the writing of it, and I'm sure I've spoken to you about this before, I always just try to see, I'm very much trying to be in the head of the character, and while I was writing all these sort of internal thoughts that Malcolm has, and he's haunted by demons and memories, and he drinks, and his grip on his own sanity is gradually loosening, but it never came into my head when I'm filtering his thoughts that he might decide, well, I've had enough of this, I'm going to get out of here. He's just there.
It never seems to cross his mind at all.
No, it didn't cross my mind, so it therefore didn't cross his mind.
And Benbecula itself, I mean, it's a really strong sense of place, almost like a character in its own right, that seems to affect the hearts and minds of those who live there, and particularly this family.
Yeah, I mean, it was really important for me. I'd never been to the Outer Hebrides at all, even although, as you know, I've got links to West Ross on the mainland, and I've been to like some of the other islands, but I'd never been to, and certainly never been to Benbecula. But it felt very important for me to go to the island, if only because I would have felt it was slightly unethical to have written without even having set foot in the place. But I went up there, and I went in January just before that massive storm, and I was actually there during the massive storm, Storm Ewan or whatever it was called.
So were you stuck?
I spent a lot of time checking the Kalmar camp, I must say. I didn't actually get stuck, but I thought I was going to get stuck. One of the most, or possibly the most fascinating thing in the archive was a hand-drawn map of the murder locations.
Wow.
And so I went armed with that. And I compared it to the 1851 Ordnance Survey map of the area. And both those maps showed that there were only 2 settlements in this area of land between the road and the shore at Linneclet. So I was there in the driving wind and rain, stomping around with my photocopy of this map, looking at the various ruins. And there was only really 2 sets of ruins, and there was only 2 settlements on these maps.
Wow.
I was like, this is it. I'm now standing amongst the stones where these events unfolded. It was quite, you you kind of get goosebumps.
Sure.
And in a way, it was a kind of fun bit of detective work, but that didn't really affect the writing, other than I am now standing where Malcolm is sitting in his house that he kind of thinks of as a skull, the casing of a skull. I always think of it now as the skull house.
That's exactly what I've got written down. He says house is a skull and Malcolm is the brain contained within it, which is such a lovely image.
Yeah, and so I was able then to, I can see the landscape that he sees, and of course that's important because it's very, very flat, and obviously influenced by the weather. When I was there, it was desolate, very desolate. And it's not a pretty landscape. And Benbecula is kind of quite flat and featureless with a lot of low-lying water.
Right.
So it's not sort of rolling hills and, like eagles flying above. And so that being able to walk around that landscape and, looking to the east and west along the setting of the book, that was really important, and that really informed how I thought about Malcolm in his skull house, looking out and seeing the passers-by and all that sort of thing. He's stuck inside a lot of the time, but there's little things going on out beyond. But as he says, it's a very small universe.
Yeah.
Very claustrophobic.
And that image itself really struck me, a kind of gothic image, obviously the skull and the person inside it. Do you think at any time you're writing in a Scottish Gothic tradition, or do you never even consider how you're writing? You just write this book?
Well, I don't really consider what tradition I might be writing in, and I don't. I suppose I have inadvertently, or without realising what I'm reading, have read some of the works within Scottish tradition, and actually, as I was writing the book, more and more I felt that Malcolm was becoming, or saw himself, and you kind of alluded to it yourself, Alistair, he was almost becoming a sort of parallel figure to Angus.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, I'm rewriting Jekyll and Hyde. And I did actually. So I went, and it's sort of organically in the reading. I was like reading things that are kind of related to what I'm writing. Although I wouldn't read a contemporary novel that I might feel I was on similar terrain to, but when it's in a classic work. So I went back and reread Jekyll and Hyde, which is just like, it's a very, very good book.
It is indeed,
and there are passages of brilliant writing in it. And I do make a couple of quite deliberate allusions to the book, which people may or may not notice. It's not important to notice the allusion, but it's what I was doing was making a parallel between Malcolm and Angus, and that Malcolm in a way is a sort of more civilised version, where Angus is a sort of unconfined id. He just acts on all his impulses and has no restraint. And whereas it's not that Malcolm doesn't have these impulses, it's that he's able to restrain himself.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of parallel. So if that's me operating within the Scottish Gothic tradition, guilty as charged.
Because it does examine madness, I guess, and the idea of that. And is the difference, you think, that Malcolm has a kind of strong a sense of morality, whereas Angus is unfettered by such things?
Well, he is to some extent, he is civilised in the sort of Freudian sense. He is aware of his, he has dirty thoughts about Mrs. MacLeod,
of course,
who comes round to give him his bath once a month, and he's a man with a sexuality, and but he knows that that's to be dealt with within the privacy of one's own, space, and not, in the middle of a field or by chasing young girls down as they're working in the fields and so on, like Angus may have done. So yeah, he's a kind of functioning, civilized human being.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure you've been asked this many, many times, possibly by me. But do you think that historical fiction such as this it kind of necessarily speaks to today, that you can't help but compare how someone like Angus was treated then and how perhaps he would be treated today?
I think that's always a question that might occur after the event of writing. I mean, certainly I wouldn't ever... I never think I'm writing historical fiction. I don't even know what that is really.
Yeah.
Because you're just writing fiction, and all fiction is set at a certain point in time. And you try to be true to that point in time, whether it's, if you're writing a contemporary novel, set in a high school, you'd have to get the language that the kids use right, otherwise the illusion would be broken. So that's the same whether it's 1857 or 2057.
Yeah.
I think, it was kind of instructive when His Bloody Project started getting translated and going around the world. And I had written a book about a village in Scotland in the 19th century, and it never crossed my mind that it might have any resonance beyond that. But then the book travels and people see resonances and parallels with situations in their own countries, whether it's, serfs in Russia or Aboriginal people in Australia and so on, and that's like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But it's not an intention of mine.
No.
It didn't have any impact whatsoever on the writing of the book, but I used the phrase care in the community earlier. And, obviously there are still debates within how we deal with people suffering from mental illnesses, especially maybe psychotic mental illnesses, and whether they should be confined or whether they should be allowed to, move freely in the community. And maybe there have been cases where, bad acts have occurred because people haven't been confined. I'm not proposing one thing or the other.
No.
Yeah, you could see parallels, and it was quite striking that the community did come round to Malcolm's house, or Malcolm's family's house, and say something needs to be done about this. And if he's not going to be confined to an asylum, which there was no asylum nearby, anyway, the reach of the state was very limited in these places. So yeah, it was like, how do we as a community deal with person? There's lots of cases of people who suffer from epilepsy in the Highlands in the 19th century and so on, where they would be tied up and confined by their families.
You said earlier on that when you were in Benbecula, you kind of got goosebumps standing in that place, and I was thinking you kind of get goosebumps reading the book, I think, and the word that came through to me as I was reading was haunted.
Right.
The place, but the people as well, by this terrible event that occurs, particularly Malcolm, but to the community as a whole.
Yeah.
Because, how do you deal with something so horrible?
Yeah. Malcolm is absolutely haunted, not only by what has happened, but by the thought of, he's living in the same rooms where the bodies were found. It's worth saying that these murders were pretty brutal. Angus, and it's not a spoiler, he used a big stone, to break his parents' heads. And the aunt as well. And the aunt, yeah. It must have been a monumental event in
such a small.
But it's sort of small, and I think sort of quite dispersed community. Looking at those maps, they weren't living in a village.
What's just out of interest? What size has Benbecula?
It's about 10 kilometres to 7 miles by 7 miles,
okay.
Sort of north to south and east to west. So it's a small island, and at that time, although now there's a road that links it to North Uist and to South Uist, at that time it was an island, but you would cross, as is described in the book, you could cross at low tide, certainly to North Uist, So again, there's a sense of isolation there. But then we are sort of cosmopolitan bohemians from the Central Belt, so we see it as a far away and isolated place. Whereas for Malcolm, again, this speaks to like trying to see the world from his point of view. He doesn't know where Glasgow is.
Yeah,
he might have heard of Glasgow, but for him, there's almost a joke in the first page. It's like I've never been to the great cosmopolitan places like Portree.
Yeah.
Because that's even Portree on the Isle of Skye would be like far, far away for him. He says I've been once or twice to Lochmaddy, which is on North Uist. So I mean, he is the centre of his own universe, and he's at the centre of it. And there's areas down that way to Borv, and the other way to Craigory, and Lochdaar across the water, and that's the extent of his universe.
It is. That's his world, and I think with often, if you've got a strong sense of place wherever you're from, you either think I'm going to stay here or return here, or I'm going to get out of here, and that's interesting that within that one family you get that split.
Yeah, and I suppose again, there were so many families from the Highlands and Islands. They were either forced off the land, or they chose to make their lives elsewhere. Get on a boat to America, Canada. Obviously, especially when you go to Canada, you realise just how many people made that journey, voluntarily or not, and stayed and sought opportunity. And it would have been, everybody would have known about the possibilities that existed. But I think I saw, I wasn't really thinking about these characters in a sort of sociological, historical sense. I was very much, it was much more interesting to me to just be inside Malcolm's head in a sort of, I'm loath to use the word sort of metaphysical way. It's a much more abstract book, I think, than I've written before. And the other book, talking about reading, rereading Stevenson, and again, as I started embarking on this, and I've created this character, and he's in his skull house in this desolate landscape, and I couldn't help but think about Beckett. And I reread the Beckett trilogy. I actually listened to the first two parts on audiobook.
Right.
Absolutely brilliantly read. And but I because the Beckett trilogy is so much about an increasingly isolated and immovable consciousness, just going over and over things in his own mind and becoming increasingly alienated perhaps from reality. So I found it useful to reread that, and it's also Beckett writes with amazing rhythm.
Yes.
And Beckett in these books, he'll pick on a tiny detail and like parse it 20 different ways, at great length, and the repetition becomes almost a joke. And it was this was me trying to get myself into a headspace of attempting to write and follow the rhythm of Malcolm's thoughts. I don't do it at anything like the length that Beckett does, but in a way, I was kind of drawing on that kind of way of writing. Well,
because you are with Malcolm all the time, he does return to events over and over again throughout. I'm interested in something you said a wee bit earlier about when you realise that people around the world, particularly with his bloody project, are responding to it in such strong ways, and you think, but it's written specific place, specific time. And I guess that must be fascinating to get feedback like that.
Mind blowing. I mean, and it's like it's incredible because, I mean, I'm never one for sort of spouting advice, and I don't think every writer goes about things in their own way. But I'm very much a believer in the idea that you should write about the specific and examine it in the detail of what it is, and not aspire to universality or whatever. Don't try to make it apparent that something is relevant to something else. That's for the reader to do.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is whether you're writing about a guy, sitting, feeling insecure in a restaurant in France and his own, thought processes and insecurities, or a young woman in 1960s London, people respond because they recognise those thought processes. And, because we tend to think certain cultures maybe think differently or have, and I'm sure, of course, they do, but, people, it's hard for me to generalise, because, I don't know how people in China responded to case study. But it's been translated into Chinese. I haven't had a lot of feedback on that. But, generally speaking, people recognise the humanity in the characters. And then, of course, we read translated fiction. It's like, my favourite book is Crime and Punishment. Yeah. And, here's me as a sort of 21st century man. Well, I'm stuck in the 20th century, really, but, and there's Raskolnikov with his, wild thought processes and ideas, and they're so familiar to me and recognisable. His behaviour is recognisable to me, and the behaviour of, his friend Razumikin, and the characters in that book resonate with me, and I don't feel like I'm reading a historical fiction. It's real to me, and I relate to those characters, and that's why we still read the book, not because it's a classic, well, that's why it's a classic, because it still seems relevant, and I think I reread The Devils recently, Dostoevsky's another of his, and The Devils doesn't have that resonance for me. It feels like a historical artifact, right, of time and place. Yes, and it doesn't. I don't really relate to it. Other people might, but I think we read novels because we want to recognise ourselves in the characters and stuff, And you mentioned a French man in a cafe. Are you missing Georges Gorski yet? No, well, it's funny because that book came out the last book, Case Match Side, came out a year ago. Just won International Crime Fiction Prize. Which I noticed that, and that's why I was thinking. Shamelessly boasting about, but that was really gratifying because I'd finished this project, which the 3 books, written over a period of 10 years or more. And it was really nice to mark the final book with a sort of nice piece of recognition like that, which I was totally shocked by, I was so surprised. Delighted to read that because I think it's rare for the last part of a trilogy or for any kind of later book in a series, because it's often the first book that gets the attention. For sure, yeah. And here's, so it's really for the whole 3. That's what I think. I think of it as one project in some ways. So. But I'm pretty good at moving quite swiftly along mentally, even once a book comes out. Benbecula was written and edited and going into publication within a year, which is like unbelievably fast. Yeah. Not only from the writing process, but from the publication process. But normally there's a much bigger lag, and by the time you've actually finished all the edits on a book and then it's come out, it'll be like at least sort of 6 or 9 months later, and you'll have moved on mentally to the next project. And I tend to do that quite quickly. And you inhabit the mental space of the next project, which in my case is very often very, very different. Yes, but I wouldn't say I miss Gorski because I'm very happy with the conclusion of that trilogy and how it ends, but I'll always have I can very clearly picture myself in the streets of Saint Louis. I know them so well, and when I walked around that town, I walk around where I live now, in the south side of Glasgow, and well, because I moved here recently, I tend to look around and notice stuff. Sure. But generally speaking, when you move around your own neighbourhood, you're thinking about someone else. You're on the way to buy a pint of milk and you don't really notice stuff. Whereas when I was in Saint Louis, I was always looking around because that's why I was there. I was there to observe stuff. So I've got a very, very strong visual image of it. So is actually visiting the place you're writing about so far for you been of importance? Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've always walked around. I mean, now you mention it, every single book I've written, include, obviously with His Bloody Project set in Westeros, I would go up there and walk up and down around Kildare and Applecross. I already knew that area pretty well. Benbecula, it was important to go there. And with Saint Louis, the French books, the Gorski books, really, really important for me to... everything, and some of the bars and so on are fictional, but the layout of the streets is completely as it is in Saint Louis. And if you've never been to Saint Louis, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But it's part of me trying to fuel that what I'm writing as an authenticity, which is a word I sort of find myself returning to very often.
And you said at Wigton Book Festival there you did your first Benbecula event, and I wonder, do you learn things about your own book when you start to discuss it with other people?
You do, because you learn, because I try not to intellectualize about what I'm doing while I'm doing it, because that's, to me, that's something that could break what I regard as the authenticity of what remaining within the process and following the logic of the characters and so on. But then, of course, it goes out into the world, and you feel like, when I was writing this, and I found, until you start doing events and talking about it, but you don't know what you're going to say. And when I was doing the event the other night, I was reflecting on the fact that when I wrote the book, I wrote a lot of it, I wrote it through the winter here, and January was brutal in Glasgow, and it seemed to go on for 3 months, and I just moved house, and it was really, really cold in the house, and it was kind of dark, felt like it was dark for ages. And I felt like that darkness really imbued the writing of the book.
You were in a skull.
It's like, yeah. It's like these two things are inseparable for me. And I felt like the book is really, really dark. And I've said it to everyone I've given a copy to, which is a very small number of people. And now, maybe because I've almost warned people, oh my God, it's really, really dark, And they're like, oh no, I thought it was really funny. So it's like, you don't really know how people are going to respond. And also I thought that Malcolm was just such an unpleasant character with no redeeming features whatsoever. But then everybody that I've spoken to so far, I'm interested to know what you made of it, has found some sort of, found him a very human character and found him quite sort of sympathetic or empathetic.
I think he's a human character. Partly that idea about staying, and because he has got this sense of morality, but there are faults, but he recognises them, whereas maybe it's in comparison to his brother.
Yeah.
And because there is humour in it, there's no doubt about it, but there's also brutality in it. Real brutality that you don't shy away from. So dark humour, yes, I guess you could say that. But no, I think that's interesting about Malcolm, because I think there are redeeming features, but they're very human redeeming features, very honest. He's kind of honest with himself, particularly in his relationships with other people. Not that there's that many, but...
But in terms of, I think you learn what the book is by other people's responses to it, or you learn what it is to them. And, it's particularly, I'm going up to Falkland, the Stornoway Festival in Stornoway. And there was talk of me going to do an event in Benbecula. Right. But I don't know what the locals will make of what I've written about our island. We'll see. Generally speaking, I don't think people often don't take kindly to being written about by outsiders. Sure. But, as a novelist, you have to set your book somewhere, and, you're not obliged to write in a complimentary way about a place. I'm very rude about Saint Louis in France.
Yeah, they seem to embrace you,
I think there's been a wee bit of disgruntlement, but I've been over there a few times, and I've spoken in the high school a couple of times, and I think it's, on the one hand, it's also like, you're really rude about the town, but at least you noticed. Nobody's ever written about it before.
Well, I wonder, in terms of the true story which underlies Benbecula, whether that might be the case, that, as you say, I mean, I wasn't aware of it, and hardly anyone was. This
as far as I know,
terrible crime.
There was very little written about it in the press at the time. There was one story written when the murders occurred, and there was another story written when the trial occurred. And if you compare that to, the Madeleine Smith case, which took place in the same year, the wall-to-wall coverage in the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald of the Madeleine Smith case, whereas 500 words were expended on the murders of 3 people in the Highlands. But and I only asked a couple of people when I was up in Benbecula if they knew about the murders that had occurred, and they said, and these were local people. They didn't know about it. And the hotel I stayed in, which is called the Darkland Tale,
right?
That's about 300, 400, 500 meters from where these murders happened.
And did anyone there know?
Not that I spoke to. So whether they were like, oh, brilliant, there was a brutal murder here, it may bring people to stomp around that same piece of shoreland that I stomped around, and but those ruins, which have been there for 150 years, then they take on a different meaning. If this is where something dark and very brutal occurred, as opposed to just being another ruined Highland cottage.
Did the success of his bloody project promote tourism? Do you think? Were there people that went to visit?
Oh, there's unquestionably people have gone to Applecross, on the back of the book, for sure, because I met people, when I've been up there myself. The difference with Applecross is already a tourist haven. Incredibly, it's over the Beach and Bow, one of the most spectacular road in Scotland. You get down, Applecross Inn, the best food in the whole of Scotland. I love that place, and so it was already. It's already
on the map.
It's already on the tourist map. But Kildue is kind of further along from the village of Applecross, and it's along a dead end road which leads to a village called Toskeg, and it's even off that road, so it's a dead end off a dead end. But so you wouldn't normally visit Kildue unless you were staying in a B&B there.
Yeah.
But if you Google Kildue now, there's a B&B in Kildue that begins by saying there were no murders here. So it's almost the fictional murders that were set there have become part of the story of the place. But people have definitely done a little bit of tourist trail and got the picture taken next to the Kildue sign and stuff. You
said that you're good at once you finish the book, moving on to whatever's next. Have you moved on to whatever's next?
I have kind of mentally. I mean, actually, even before Benbecula came along, as I described, I'd started doing some research for another project. Then Benbecula came along, so that kind of was an opportunity I wanted to take advantage of. So that kind of interrupted. So now I'm back in the mental space of the next project, which I know you're dying for me to tell you about.
Yeah, but I know you probably won't.
it's at such a sort of embryonic stage at the moment, and it's a big project, and it's one that feels like a culmination of lots of different elements of things I've done in my previous books, and it's going to take me a long time to write it. And I know already from sort of tentatively trying out bits of writing various passages that it's going to evolve a lot more than other pieces of work I've done. But it's going to be a while before I'm back on the podcast.
I was going to say that means.
but I'd love to make a date.
Yes, we'll definitely have you back on no matter what. Graeme, thanks so much for talking to us. Benbecula's a fantastic book, and all the best with it.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.